best heck that we've had in about 3 or 4 meetings.
With my foot just on your
Now, does that actually the way it does? Okay. Roxy, we have some questions from outside the hall first, to be fair.
This one is from Nadia, and it's for all candidates. It's a bit of a lengthy one. I also must apologise, we had some issues with the live stream, but we've fixed it up now. So this is a question for all the candidates. In defiance of international law, Israel has continued to expand settlements on occupied Palestinian land in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. It has also declared an intention to annex Palestinian territory. Would you agree to sanction Israel for its actions by, for example, banning the import of settlement goods into New Zealand and ensuring the superannuation fund is not investing in companies with business arrangements in the illegal settlement?
Who wants to go first on that one? Why don't you, Grant? You're the finance minister.
2 minutes still applies, timekeeper.
That was it, 2. Yeah. Thank you for the question, and not really a 2-minute topic, to be honest. Look, you know, the policy of the government is for a two-state solution. That's been a consistent policy of the New Zealand government for many, many years. We've seen a significant aggression from Israel over recent times, and I do acknowledge that. In terms of sanctions, we go with UN-based sanctions, and that's not on the table at the moment. New Zealand's role's got to continue to be to push for peace in the Middle East and make sure that everybody that we can influence is influenced by that. So it's a foreign policy priority at the UN for New Zealand to get a two-state solution.
What Grant said. So the Green Party's on record at talking about how we need to work towards a two-state solution as well. The one thing that I would say about there is an international movement to put on sanctions and divestment and bans when it comes to Israel. That movement is often used as cover for antisemitic movements, and so I cannot agree to the proposition, because that particular movement actually has a very, very nasty undercurrent to it. But that isn't to say that I agree with the actions that Israel has taken. I don't, and I think that the international community does need to get its act together and to apply more pressure to make sure that actually Israel doesn't annex the West Bank.
Jesse, have you answered the question about Israel before?
I think so. So I just want to say that as someone who's part of the Jewish community here in Wellington, obviously the issue of Israel and anti-Semitism as well is something that's close to my heart. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that there is some anti-Semitism inherent in the boycott, divest and sanction movement, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't take the human rights of Palestinians seriously, and that we shouldn't very seriously consider what Israel is doing in its aggressive moves towards the Palestinian people. And so to that end, I think that New Zealand should be a moral force on the world stage for standing up for human rights everywhere, and I do support the sanctioning of Israel in general, although I agree with what Grant said about the problem that you might encounter with unilateral sanctioning, so that's something we have to take very seriously and not leap into without thinking about it beforehand, but I do support the boycott, divest and sanction movement in general.
I guess with Israeli politics, there's always a hope that the sort of, the left-wing elements that were there, at least at one point, will gain a bit more of a foothold. It's kind of been deteriorating over their last few electoral cycles, but let's not forget their last few electoral cycles were all within 1 year, so lucky us. BDS could be more nuanced. There is marginalizing all of Israel as one thing, marginalizes those progressive forces as well. It's the Netanyahu government that is the problem, I guess. Yeah.
I love Hamas! The first thing that comes to my mind is just a feeling of being so grateful that we live in this country where we don't have to actively worry about war when we're getting up in the morning. But I don't see how having a moral stance on either side of that issue can be good for us as a country, because once we start making those decisions, we start having to worry about every single trade agreement that we're striking internationally, and we currently have deals with people who, for some groups, we would deem far more misogynistic and less than we would want to see in our own society. But also, we think of the people in China and in Hong Kong having their freedom of speech taken away from them. And so once you start going down this path, where do you stop? I'd like to see us having a more open world and a more open society and trading freely, because that's how I think that we create peace.
Thank you, Nadia, for your question. And can I just acknowledge that this is an issue where there is broad agreement across our major parties, and where National and Labour have, over successive governments, stood for a two-state solution and sanctions via the UN. I do want to pick up on what Jessie said about emerging strain of anti-Semitism in our community. I think one of the more sad events in this term of Parliament is seeing a swastika drawn on one of our local Jewish temples, and I think it is a reminder to all of us that this does exist in our community, and we have to not be bystanders but stand up against it wherever we see it. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicola.